So look, I'm going to talk about controversies in decompression. And look, I have to admit, I know from personal experience that when that topic comes up, a lot of people just switch off and they think it's going to be a didactic, formula-based lecture. I promise you, there's not a single formula in this presentation. I just want to reassure you of that. It is inevitably a little bit didactic, and I appreciate that there'll be different knowledge levels amongst the group, and I apologise to those of you who already have a sophisticated knowledge of this. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, but I'm trying to be sure that I bring everybody through with us as we talk about this subject. This is the language I'm going to use here, the terms I'm going to talk about, the concepts I'm going to discuss are of high relevance to divers everywhere, and I think if I can let a little bit of the language rub off on you, that will be useful for you. I just want to acknowledge David Dulett, my colleague in a lot of the modelling work that I've done. This is David here. This is us at the 2004 remote workshop in Sydney. David is Australian, but he was heading over to work at the Naval Experimental Diving Unit in the United States, and this is him practicing to be an American here. This is me being a typical Southern Hemisphere person. But he's the mathematical genius in our collaboration. I myself am a mathematical imbecile, so I'm unlikely to challenge you too much in that regard. I went to medical school and joined the Navy after leaving medical school, became part of the operational diving team to have credibility with the boys. I was their doctor. I'd just like to point out this is me here, not here. Just so that clear up any ambiguity about that. And then after the Navy, of course, in my medical career, and I've been involved in technical and rebreather diving with lots of exploration of deep wrecks, and I remain incredibly passionate about that. And some of the images, well, all of the images you see today, pretty much all of them are taken by me, and they're from the various adventures that we've had on different wrecks. And that brings me to this slide here, which is actually a picture of me taken by Peter Mesley. This is me underneath the Nagato at Bikini Atoll. The Nagato was the battleship that Yamamoto was standing on when he ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. Quite a lot of history there. But as a technical diver, the thing that obsesses you, and it obsesses all the technical divers, is what is the optimal approach to decompression? How should we decompress from these deep mixed gas dives? And just as an example of that, a recent internet forum thread on this subject had 95,000 hits. 95,000. Now, a lot of those were people coming back to read the thread multiple times as it evolved, but nevertheless, it is indicative of the amount of interest that is out there on this subject. The trouble is, of course, that the internet is where the divers get their information from, and as medical people, I'm sure you'll appreciate the concept of the internet being a source of accurate information on anything medical or physiological is, well, it reminds me a little bit of something we learnt about at medical school called the Bristol stool form scale, which so there's a lot of excretia out there. It's all excretia. Some of it's good, but a lot of it's not, and it's very hard for the uninformed person to tell the difference. So, by the way, I am making a few assumptions here, and one of them is that I'm in South Africa, and you're probably a fairly broad-minded audience. I probably wouldn't neglect to show this slide in the United States. Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about today, the way we'll structure this presentation, is I just want to define saturation and bounce diving, just to be clear that what we're talking about today is decompression from bounce diving. Then I'll go on and develop for you a way of depicting decompression, and that's the place in this presentation I really don't want you to go to sleep, because that's how I'm going to illustrate everything else in the presentation. So we'll figure out a way of depicting decompression, and then I'll talk about the different philosophical approaches to decompression using that depiction. I'll then present the evidence for one over the other, and finally draw a few conclusions. So let's just quickly deal with this issue, because Jörg has been talking a bit about saturation diving this morning, and I want to be clear that it's not saturation diving I'm talking about. And in fact, as he alluded to, the decompressions from saturation diving are actually quite well understood and fairly safe. It's a very controlled process. We've done it lots of times and we know how to do it. So this diagram here illustrates what we mean by saturation diving, and essentially we have depth and time, and if you spend long enough on a dive, then all your tissues become saturated with the inert gas that you're respiring. And so it doesn't actually matter how long you, after that point, it doesn't matter how long you spend there, the decompression stays exactly the same length. Are you happy with that concept? I think you probably all know this. As I say, I'm sorry, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but that's important. Now, the contrast is with so-called bounce diving. And in this setting, the more time you spend on the bottom, the longer your decompressions get. So this is the sort of simplest form of a bounce dive, which is the so-called no-stop dive, which is what most people do. You know, most scuba air divers do no-stop dives. That's what they're taught to do. So you can always make a direct descent to the surface. But when you start adding time to your bottom, so you exceed your no decompression limits, then you have to decompress and the surfacing becomes longer. And any increase in bottom time means that your decompression becomes correspondingly longer. And I just want to be clear that it's this kind of diving that I'm talking about today. That's what the recreational technical divers are doing. Of course, if you extended this bottom time out long enough, it would eventually become a saturation dive and the decompression time wouldn't change. Okay, so having got that definition out of the way, I just want to move on to this depiction of decompression. Now, like I said before, this is the bit I want you to try and follow through with me, because the rest of the talk kind of depends on it to some extent. Now, I think you all know this, that during a dive, the pressure of inert gas that we breathe increases. So the pressure of inert gas in your alveoli increases. That gas diffuses almost instantaneously and equilibrates instantaneously with the pressure of inert gas in the arterial blood. And that gas gets carried off to the tissues, and the pressure of gas in those tissues increases towards the pressure in the arterial blood. And I think you're also familiar with the concept that that happens in different tissues at different rates. So some tissues equilibrate with the arterial pressure of inert gas, in this case nitrogen, more quickly and some more slowly. And that depends largely, the most important factor is the tissue's perfusion. So tissues that get more blood flow tend to equilibrate more quickly with the arterial pressure. So what I want to do is depict that process in a diagram where we can follow through a sort of typical dive. So this is the diagram. This is how it works. Along this axis I've got pressure or depth. So this is our depth, and this is what's happening with the tissue gas pressure. And let me take you through a simple dive, and let's follow what happens on this diagram. So at the start of a dive, we descend, and the ambient pressure, the depth, increases quickly. But the tissue gas pressure won't increase quickly because it takes time for gas to wash into a tissue. So it'll look a bit like this. As we descend, the ambient pressure is increasing, the tissue gas pressure is increasing a little bit as we absorb some inert gas, but not quickly. And then we stop at this depth here. And that's where we're going to spend our bottom time. We're going to swim around, take some photos, whatever it is we want to do. So we're going to spend time at this depth. And of course, if we spend time at that depth, the depth doesn't change, but we'll start to absorb gas into our tissues, right? So the tissue gas pressure will start to increase over that period of bottom time. Now, of course, time is the factor that's not well depicted on this diagram. So you just have to assume that time has passed. One of the questions you might ask is, well, how high can the tissue gas pressure go? And if you think about it, the answer is it can't go any higher than the ambient pressure, because it's the ambient pressure that's driving the gas into the tissues. So if you draw a line where the tissue pressure equals the ambient pressure, it can't go higher than that while you're swimming around on the bottom. So if we spend long enough there, eventually a tissue will reach this point, and then it won't absorb any more inert gas. It's now saturated. Okay? So we consider if a tissue reaches that point, it's now saturated with inert gas at that depth. Now, of course, I said before that different tissues absorb inert gas at different rates. So, in fact, while one tissue might be saturated like that, there'll be a bunch of other tissues that will not have absorbed that much inert gas at that point in the dive. Is everyone happy with where we're at so far? Okay, good. All right. For the sake of simplicity, though, let's just focus on one tissue, and we'll choose that one that's up here, which has absorbed pretty much all of the gas that it can absorb. So the next question is, what happens when the diver begins ascending? And it's a bit like the descent. The ambient pressure is going to decrease quickly. The tissue gas pressure will decrease more slowly because it takes time for gas to wash out of the tissue. So it'll look a bit like this. The ambient pressure is decreasing as we ascend, but the tissue gas pressure isn't decreasing as quickly. And of course, at this point here, what you can see is that the tissue gas pressure is now higher than the ambient pressure. And that difference we refer to as supersaturation. So the pressure of gas in the tissue is higher than the ambient pressure. That's inert gas supersaturation. And that is critical because supersaturation, as I'm sure you know, I get that you're probably all sitting there thinking, yeah, come on, get on with it. We know all this stuff. But it's important we develop this because this is how I'm going to illustrate the principles that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Supersaturation is the fundamental requirement for bubble formation from dissolved inert gas. That's why it's important. And having said that, it's no surprise then that decompression strategies, no matter which one you choose, they all fundamentally aim to limit supersaturation within safe boundaries by using decompression stops. So if we stopped at this depth here and waited, the tissue gas pressure would fall because we're sitting there eliminating the gas. Can you see what I'm getting at in the diagram? All right. So let's now, having developed that depiction of decompression, let's move on and talk about the decompression strategies that we can use to limit supersaturation, to choose how much supersaturation we should allow. So we've already seen this slide here, and having said this, there's an obvious question. And the obvious question is, how do we decide the allowable supersaturation and therefore how far we can come up to before we have to stop? There are two approaches to this. And one is called, so the two approaches are gas content models and bubble models. How many people have heard of those two approaches? A few people, not many. Okay, so we're getting into some new territory here. That's good. So the two approaches, but trust me, if you are talking to a diver who does decompression diving, they will understand this language because this is a hot subject for them. So their kind of lives depend on it in many respects. So the first approach is the so-called gas content models. And the philosophy here is that what you aim to do is have as much tissue supersaturation as you possibly can whilst remaining safe. Because the more supersaturation you have, the more gradient there is for gas to diffuse out of the tissues and into the blood and be breathed out at the lungs. So the idea is to maximise supersaturation within safe limits. And those safe limits were first proposed by Haldane. This is how he did it. Haldane's model was a gas content model. And then his limits have been mucked around with and adjusted and empirically modified based on outcomes of real dives and animal experiments. And so the way this works, well actually, going back to our diagram here, let me observe, because Jörg is here especially, that the most famous set of supersaturation limits are the ZHL-16 ascent rules proposed by Professor Buhlmann, who was a Swiss professor of physiology. Zurich limits, ZHL is Zurich limits, and 16 refers to the number of theoretical tissues that he modelled the gas kinetics for in proposing these limits. So remember before I showed you how different tissues would be at different levels of gas pressure on this line here. Well, he had 16 tissues that he modelled in deriving these limits. And the way these limits work is pretty simple. There's nothing, it's not rocket science, this. Basically, for any tissue, there'll be a supersaturation limit. And each one of those 16 tissues has a slightly different limit. The faster tissues generally are allowed more supersaturation and the slower tissues less supersaturation, but they'll all have a limit. And so you can see how this is going to work, can't you? If we've got a tissue that's got this amount of inert gas in it and we start to ascend, what Buhlmann is telling us is we can ascend until this tissue reaches its supersaturation limit. Then we've got to stop. And if we stop at this depth here, which will be our first decompression stop, then the inert gas level will fall. We just wait and it'll fall. And then we can continue. So we ascend a bit more and we hit the limit again, so we stop and the tissue level falls, we ascend, stop, tissue level falls, and then we ascend making sure that we're under the limit that you're allowed when you surface. And that is a classic approach to a gas content model decompression. Of course, there are 16 tissues. So the way that works is that you do these kind of calculations for every one of those tissues, and it's whichever one is getting nearest its supersaturation limit, that becomes the controlling tissue. But for simplicity, we'll just stick with one. You happy with that? And so that's a gas content model. And look, these worked. Haldane's model looked very much like this. He calculated his supersaturation limits a little bit differently, but they worked. And when Haldane introduced the first gas content model, there was a marked fall in the amount of decompression sickness they were experiencing on the jobs that he was involved in. They worked. However, having said that, we all know that this is true. Despite the use of these models, decompression sickness still did occur, just as it does today, even though divers stick to their limits. And venous gas emboli, so bubbles in the veins, could still be detected. And since bubbles are the cause of decompression sickness, a number of people, and this was going on for a few decades before we started actually using these models, it was realised that reasoned that an approach which aimed to produce fewer bubbles might be more successful. And this led to the so-called bubble models. Right, so here's a key point, because this is the distinction between the two types. The key point with bubble models was that their proponents believed that the initial large supersaturations allowed by a gas content model were too big. They believed that what happened when you did that initial large ascent to your first decompression stop, you caused bubble formation with the big supersaturation. Remember, these models were trying to maximise supersaturation while staying safe. These guys felt that those supersaturations were too big. And if you made them smaller, little smaller increments of supersaturation, you wouldn't provoke as many bubbles being formed. So the way they approached decompression was more like this. They reasoned that you don't want to come this far towards the surface. You don't want this big an ascent. You want a smaller supersaturation early on to stop bubbles from forming. So their approach looked like this. A smaller initial supersaturation, so you'd ascend, but then you'd stop earlier. So instead of your first decompression stop being here at this depth, it would be here at this depth, much deeper. And then your decompression would proceed like this. In smaller increments of supersaturation, with the idea being that those smaller increments would reduce bubble formation. And eventually you would surface, and the way I've drawn this is entirely intentional. You would surface actually with a higher level of supersaturation than a gas content model, because these guys reasoned that if you've controlled bubble formation here, then you can get away with having more supersaturation at the surface. And in fact, these decompressions were shorter, and they had shorter shallow stops, and they were shorter overall. And of course, divers like short decompressions when you've been in the water for 4 or 5 hours and you're cold and worried about great white sharks and all that kind of stuff. It's quite nice to get out of the water as quickly as possible. And this, for obvious reasons, this approach, this bubble model approach, became almost synonymous with the concept of deep stops being good. So you'll hear this term deep stops, and it's essentially synonymous with bubble models, although there are a couple of exceptions to that, which I'll talk about. Now, so putting that behind us, and hopefully you've got a concept of the differences between these approaches, you're probably sitting there thinking that sounded really sensible. That bubble model approach sounded great. Oh, like smaller supersaturations, less bubble formation, get out of the water even quicker. You're probably thinking, wow, that's cool. And that's exactly what divers thought. I mean, the idea was so theoretically attractive that it became almost unstoppable. And in the early 2000s, virtually all technical divers abandoned gas content models and started using bubble models for decompression. And gas content models were sort of derided as being bend and mend exercises. So you would have these big supersaturations early, so you bend yourself, and then you would mend yourself by having long shallow stops. So that became a buzz term for deriding gas content models. And in fact, divers who liked the simplicity of the mathematics of gas content models, the Bullman style approach, actually started to manipulate them to look like bubble models using a technique called gradient factors. Now, don't get too bogged down in this, but I'll explain what I mean. So you've got a Bullman algorithm on your computer. What you could do, instead of buying a bubble model, you could just make it look like a bubble model. And so they use these things called gradient factors. So for example, you might use gradient factors 2090. Now that won't mean anything to you. I'll explain what I mean. What that meant was that when you started your ascent, instead of ascending all the way to the Bullman limit, you would ascend till you got to 20% of the Bullman limit for that depth. And that would define your first decompression stop. And then for surfacing, you would surface at 90% of the Bullman. Oh, that would be your first stop there. And then you would surface at 90% of the Bullman limit, and the model would interpolate a line between those, and that would become your new supersaturation limit. And I'm sure you'll agree that what's unfolding there looks a lot more like that bubble model decompression that I showed you than a gas content model decompression. And that was the intention, to make it look like a bubble model. And that's where we got to. In the mid-2000s, virtually the entire technical diving community was either using a bubble model or doing this to their Bullman model to make it look like a bubble model. Now, here's a key point. None of this was based on any reliable data. None of it. It was all theoretical attraction. The notion that bubble models might be useful came from in vitro experiments using bubble formation in jelly, not a physiological model. And you'll see why that's a potential problem when we get to the rest of the discussion. So there was not a shred of human evidence that bubble models were better. But you try going online 10 years ago and saying that. So now we're going to get to a little bit of a discussion about the evidence around this issue. So I've said to you that the mid-2000s saw this wave of popularity for bubble models and that approach to decompression, and even people using gas content models were manipulating them to make them look like bubble models. But that now there's some evidence suggesting that that might not have been the right track to go down. So what is that evidence? Well, firstly, I do want to clarify something, and it's largely on the part of my esteemed colleague, Dr. Cronje, who has done some work on one form of deep stops, and that is he was involved in a study which looked at the effect of inserting a single stop on a no-stop dive at a deeper depth than a normal safety stop. That is not what I'm talking about. I just want to be clear about that. And in fact, there are a couple of conflicting studies on the effect of doing that on bubbles in your blood. Franz's study suggested that it was beneficial. There's another study that suggests it isn't. And that remains an open question. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the use of bubble models versus gas content models for proper decompression dives. So I just want to be clear about that. So the first study that came out, and this was 2005 in Aviation, Space, Environmental Medicine, was by the French group. And like the US Navy who came after them, they were thinking, because they'd always used a gas content model for their operational diving, and they were thinking of changing to a bubble model. And they did a simple study where they compared the use of their usual gas content model to 3 experimental deep stop protocols, or bubble model protocols, for 50 to 60 metre air dives. And the outcome measure was venous bubbles, not decompression sickness, just venous bubbles. And none of the deep stop, to cut a long story short, none of the deep stop protocols were superior, and one of the deep stop protocols was inferior. Now, it's not going to win them a Nobel Prize, and it's not definitive proof of anything, but this was the first time that any human evidence had appeared on the issue, and it didn't favour a bubble model approach. But it's weak, it's one profile. But that was the first. Then this study came out in 2010. Now, this is not a comparative study, but it was interesting that it was a study that looked at bubble levels in technical divers who had used a very popular bubble model to do decompressions from decompression dives, 60 to 70 metre trimix dives. And what they found was that virtually every single one of these divers who had followed the bubble model, called VPM, Varying Permeability Model, every single one of them had grade 3 or 4 venous gas emboli when they came to the surface. So by following a bubble model, they had huge numbers of bubbles. It's somewhat ironic, but that's what they found. Now, it's not a comparative study, so can't draw any conclusions from it, but it was apparent to the technical diving community at this point that the bubble model wasn't really doing what it was allegedly capable of doing. And then there was the sort of big one, I guess, the NEDU study, Naval Experimental Diving Unit at Panama City, Florida. This is the US Navy. This was a study conducted in their ocean simulation facility. And let me say that the reason for doing this study was identical to the French. The US Navy was considering changing to a bubble model for their operational diving. They had been using gas content models traditionally. They were thinking of changing to a bubble model. And so they generated 2 profiles that they were going to compare. 170 feet, 52, for 30 minutes on air. Now, you can talk a lot about why they chose that profile. It's been chosen because it's air profile, which you normally wouldn't do. You'd usually decompress on oxygen from a dive like that, but they wanted a dive that needed a sufficiently long decompression that the distribution of stop times would make a difference to the outcome potentially. And 170 feet was on the borderline of their operational limits for air. So it's quite a provocative dive, and they expected an incidence of decompression sickness. So what I'm about to tell you is that the outcome measure for this study was decompression sickness. Believe it or not. Their ethics committee was happy enough with that. And I might add, they had no shortage of volunteers. It just shows you the mindset of the average Navy diver, and I was one once, so I kind of understand this. They were falling over themselves to be part of a study which intended to bend a certain proportion of them. Interesting. But ponder on that for a moment, on how important the study is. Decompression sickness, a human study with decompression sickness is an outcome measure. It hardly ever gets done these days. You'd never see it. It's a vitally important study. So the gas content model was calculated using the same model that they've used for generating many of their air diving tables, a model called VVAL18. And the bubble model was generated by a model called BVM3, which was their Navy bubble model that they'd developed. And these are what the two profiles look like. I won't talk more about that. The dives were carefully standardized, so unprotected divers in 30-degree water, which did impose some thermal stress. You might think 30 degrees is not very cold, but unprotected for several hours, you do get cold. But it's a smart move, because having them unprotected means everyone's on an equal footing. The minute you put people in wetsuits, then you've got problems like whose wetsuit fits better, and controlling the thermal stress becomes an issue. So it's smart. 30-degree water, no protection. 115 watts exercise at the bottom. That's not particularly high, but it's enough when you're breathing dense gas at depth. And the outcomes were decompression sickness, and they also measured venous gas emboli because everyone else does, so I thought they should do it as well. And to cut to the chase, I might say this was one of the requirements the ethics committee imposed was that it would be a sequential analysis. So that they were allowed to do 400 dives on each profile, up to 400 dives, but they had to do a sequential analysis of the results so that the minute they got a statistically significant result, the trial would stop, so that you weren't exposing more people to the risk than you had to. So in fact, the trial stopped after about 200 dives in each profile because they reached a statistically significant difference in which the deep stops profile was associated with a higher incidence of decompression sickness than the gas content model. So 10 cases out of 198 dives versus 3 out of 192. And on that basis, the US Navy declined to adopt a bubble model decompression for their routine operations. As you might imagine, it's the logical conclusion from the study. Now, of course, you might anticipate that that's caused a lot of hand-wringing and anxiety in the technical diving community and amongst those people who publish and sell bubble models. And this study has been the subject of a lot of debate and mostly ill-informed criticism. The question is, why did the deep stops fail in the NEDU study? I told you that theory before. It sounded great, didn't it? You know, smaller supersaturations produce less bubbles. It should be better. But it wasn't. So why? And the answer is, it's probably an effect of deep stops on supersaturation in slow tissues later in the dive. Now let me illustrate what I mean by that. Remember what I said here? This was the diagram that I showed you to illustrate the difference between a gas content model decompression and a bubble model decompression. And the bubble model decompression had its first stop here, and the gas content model had its first stop here. So let's use that diagram to illustrate what could be wrong with the deep stop concept. So we were considering a tissue that had almost absorbed all the inert gas that it possibly could. But what about a tissue that's still here at this point? It hasn't absorbed all the inert gas that it possibly could. What's going to happen to this tissue and its inert gas content in these two types of decompression? Now, in a gas content model decompression, there's going to be a rapid ascent to the first decompression stop. So that tissue is going to end up here very quickly and is not going to absorb any more inert gas. You can see that, right? It's because the depth decreases quickly, we stop here. So that tissue will not absorb any more inert gas. However, that same tissue, if we're stopping here and stopping here and stopping here, is going to start absorbing more inert gas during those stops, potentially. Does that make sense? Can you see the concept there? So there is little doubt that deep stops protect the fast tissues from supersaturation, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is increased loading of slow tissues during those deep stops. Now, please don't freak out with this diagram. I'm going to take you through it. And so that was kind of where the argument was at, Franz, when we did the deep workshop. This is an analysis that we've done since then. And so this is a way of depicting that difference that I just showed you on this diagram here across all the 16 theoretical tissues that Bullman modelled. So this is the way this works. These, can you pick out that there's lots of little lines here? Can you see that? Yeah, so each one of those lines is a tissue, one of the Bullman tissues, from 1 to 16. These are the fastest tissues, and these are the slowest tissues. And this is time, the decompression, and this is the point of surfacing here. And this heat map, which was I must credit a guy. This was a guy that we met online, interestingly, a mathematician who got really interested in this and suggested to David and I that he generates these. He just went ahead and generated these profiles, and they're superb for understanding this issue. So this is fast tissues, slow tissues, time, surfacing. The red is supersaturation, and the blue, so more heat equals more supersaturation, so red is more than yellow is more than green, and the blue, the sort of lighter blue colours, are gas uptake, so tissues that are still taking gas up. So look at this. This is the shallow stop profile, the gas content model. So big initial ascent towards the surface, fast tissues get supersaturated, just like in my diagram, right? Like in this diagram here. Big ascent towards the surface, big supersaturation. That's what you're seeing here. Slow tissues are still taking gas on. Can you see that? Just like I'm showing here. And then as you come towards the surface, you get supersaturation. I mean, you have to have supersaturation to have outgassing. So supersaturation is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just where it's happening that seems to make a difference. Because now I'll show you the deep stops profile. So this is the NEDU deep stops profile. And what you can see is, in comparison to the gas content model, there's way less supersaturation of the fast tissues early. So the model's doing exactly what a bubble model's supposed to do. It's preventing supersaturation in the fast tissues early, in the belief that that limits bubbles and makes this less important. But look at what's happening in the shallower depths to the slower tissues. So the slower tissues, the ones further down here. Way more supersaturation, and that's because look at the gas uptake compared to here. Much more gas uptake in the slow tissues when you're doing your deep stops than in the slow tissues when you're doing a gas content model decompression where you get shallow quicker. Does that make sense? Can you see how I'm interpreting that diagram? So the key point of this is that this pattern of supersaturation, this pattern was assumed to be a good idea, and this pattern was assumed to be a bad idea. So supersaturation in fast tissues early is bad, supersaturation in slow tissues later is good or okay, but the results of the NEDU study are telling us that that's probably not right, that it's the other way around, that it's supersaturation in these intermediate and slow tissues that's causing the problems, and that fast tissue supersaturation doesn't seem to matter. And that makes some physiological sense too. I mean, Bullman knew years ago that you could tolerate more supersaturation in fast tissues. So, to reinforce that point, the Navy deep stops profile, their bubble model, did reduce supersaturation in fast tissues early, but this did not seem to be protective. And increased supersaturation of the slower tissues late is the most plausible cause for the failure of the deep stop profile, for the increase in decompression thickness in the deep stops profile. I mean, looking at that analysis, it stands right out. That's the most obvious cause. The bubble model advocates say, oh yeah, but the NEDU deep stops profile looks different to the profiles that my bubble model generates. Well, yeah, maybe. So this here is the two Navy profiles. The red one is the deep stops, the yellow one is their gas content model, and this green one is a profile generated by VPM with enough conservatism to make it the same length as the two Navy profiles. If you're comparing profiles, you have to have them the same length. I mean, anyone can generate an ultra-safe profile, just make it hours and hours longer than anything else that'll be safe. So you have to have them the same length for a comparison. And yeah, look, the VPM profile has got even more deep stops. That's the difference. And somehow we're supposed to believe that that magically is the difference between the two. And if you do the same analysis on that profile as the two Navy ones, this is what you see. So here's the two diagrams I showed you before. This one, which had less decompression thickness. This one that had more decompression thickness. And this one that the technical diving bubble model advocates are promoting. And ask yourself, which one does this one look like? It looks like this one, doesn't it? The one that had more decompression thickness. The pattern of supersaturation, less supersaturation in the fast tissues early, more supersaturation in the slow tissues late. That's what it looks like. The deep stop profile in the Navy that failed. So that was one argument that came up. And then the next argument was, well, VPMB plus 7, which is the conservatism level needed to make it as long as those Navy profiles, that's not what technical divers use. We use VPMB plus 4, which is a less conservative profile. So the argument can seem to be that VPM works when it's less conservative than when it's more conservative, which is somewhat ridiculous. But anyway, we'll go along with that. So what we did then was we compared a VPMB plus 4 profile, an 83 metre dive for 20 minutes using a closed circuit rebreather with oxygen and trimix. This is an absolute, undisputable, typical deep diving rebreather profile that technical divers would use using VPM versus a gradient factor approach. So the manipulated Bullman, but not so many deep stops, gradient factor 40, which means you stop a little bit shallower than a bubble model would make you stop. And look at the difference, again, between these profile patterns. The gradient factor profile, the Bullman profile, has less supersaturation late than the VPM profile. So the point here is that the same pattern plays out even when you compare a bubble model that no one would dispute the technical divers are using with a Bullman-based approach that lots of technical divers are using. And I think the argument is pretty solid, that when you do the analysis like this, you can see why the Navy deep stops failed, and you can see that supersaturation pattern associated with that failure repeated in the bubble models that the technical divers are using. And so, by way of conclusion, I'm not saying that we know what optimal decompression is. We don't. We don't. And the Navy study did not address that. It's not saying that raw Bullman, using the absolute Bullman limits, is correct. But what it does suggest to us is that emphasising deep stops, based on the data we have available, is probably not a good idea. Overemphasising deep stops. And almost certainly the concept's been oversold to the community. But by exactly how much, we don't know. The best evidence suggests we should de-emphasise deep stops, but I can't tell you by how much. I currently am using gradient factors, and I use a gradient factor of 50, 70 or 75. So I'm making my shallow stops quite long, and I'm making my deeper stops not as deep as a bubble model. That's the approach I'm taking. And that, to me, is a sensible response to the available data. I can't tell you how much we should reduce deep stops because we've never done the work. No one's ever done that. We just know that pure bubble model deep stops, which are pretty deep, are probably not the best approach. And that's kind of where we're sitting at the moment. So much of this is explained in a paper that David and I wrote for DHM a couple of years ago. There's two papers in the series. One is this general introduction to technical diving, and the other is a discussion of decompression from deep technical dives, and this discussion is in that paper. So, and also the NEDU study is available online. You can get it on the Rubicon site. It's there. Anyone can read it, the technical report. So that's it. Finished within. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.